Thank you, everyone. The ways in which consumers and utilities have typically interacted has been transformed by the clean energy revolution. Even as more and more consumers harness the power of renewable energy to provide lighting and heat to their homes, there is a large segment of energy users that are being left behind. What can states do to ensure that underserved communities have access to clean power? So joining us on stage for this next conversation are Richard Kauffman, the Chairman of Energy and Finance for New York Office of Governor Andrew M. Cuomo, also known as the Energy Czar. And here to lead this interview is the Atlantic's Ron Brownstein.
Thank you, Emily.
Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Czar. Thank you for joining us. New York State has been engaged in what may be the most comprehensive effort to rethink energy policy of any state in the country is something called Reforming the Energy Vision, touching on many aspects of the energy equation in the state. Give us a little sense of how the project came about and the scope of what it is dealing with.
Well, I was working in Washington for Secretary of Energy Chu. I got a call from Governor Cuomo, and it was during Hurricane Sandy, just after Hurricane Sandy, and the governor had been in the dark and cold with many suffering New Yorkers, and he told me that the utility industry was vinyl record in the age of the iPad. And so he asked me to come to New York and help him reinvent the power sector. And he was not just talking about resiliency, he was also talking about affordability. The system is increasingly unaffordable for everybody. So it's spent $17 billion in the system in the last 10 years, headed to $30 billion in the next 10 years, and it's not making the system any smarter or more resilient. And then the system is not responsive to, just we heard about in the last panel, to changing consumer demands.
Yeah. You know, I've read a lot of white papers, there have been a lot of regulatory proceedings. This has a lot of components to it. What are the core ideas? What are the core ways in which you are trying to change, in particular, financial incentives for the utility industry?
Okay, let's just think about the grid today. The grid today is the grid of Tesla and Westinghouse. It's a one-way grid. Electrons flow in one direction from large power plants through to over hundreds of miles to us as consumers. What's happened is that grid was never designed for solar or other distributed solutions, and those solutions are just being bolted on. So we've all seen pictures of the grid of the future, which is a hybrid grid which has distributed energy solutions paired with still traditional power plants. Electrons flow more than one direction, and we're not building that grid. And the reason why we're not building that grid is we have a policy regime that's just rebuilding that old grid. And what do we mean by that? Well, in many places, still around the country, utilities are compensated for the quantity of capital they commit. That's how utilities make money. And so it's not surprising that not only do we have a system which is really energy inefficient, it's also financially inefficient. So the average capacity utilization of the system is 54%, which is a really low number. And what it also means is when we think about the adoption of technology, the tremendous productivity benefits we've had in other sectors from adoption of chips, of IT, that's not a capital expenditure for most utilities. So utilities have no financial incentive to deploy that. And that's not a fault of the utilities, that's a fault of the policy regime around it.
So what have you learned about what are the kinds of incentives that would in fact encourage the deployment and the adoption of the technologies that you want to see adopted?
So maybe just a couple of other sort of statistics just to make it clear. I talked about this low average capacity utilization. Utilities spend 0.2% of sales on R&D. 0.2%. Other industries, they spend 10% of sales. So it's not because there aren't great opportunities, it's because the policies have not permitted the utilities to make those kinds of investments. On the utility bill, the average utility bill, 93% of the utility bill costs are just a pass-through from the utility to customers. The only profit opportunity is about 7%. In other businesses, companies would say, well, if we can reduce costs to customers and earn some of that, we should do that. It's a kind of, that 93% is seen as a wallet share. But that hasn't been an opportunity for utilities. And that's one of the reasons why, again, the environment does not favor innovation for utilities. And we're changing all that. So just to maybe one last point, distributed solutions really matter depending on location, because the grid has different kinds of constraints. And if you can deploy distributed solutions, solar and storage in particular locations, it's good not only for those customers, but for all customers in the system. And you can use the existing cost envelope of the whole bill to help finance the new energy system. And so what we are doing in our policy is to give the utilities a financial incentive to help deploy those distributed solutions in those locations and give the utility the opportunity to earn some of the savings that can result from reduced peak power costs, reduced capacity payments, and a whole bunch of other costs that are otherwise just a pass-through.
And all of this restructuring of incentives is occurring under the umbrella of a very ambitious goal. It's very ambitious goals on greenhouse gas reductions in the state, and moving 50% of all electricity in New York from renewables by 2030. Same goal as California. It's one thing to think about California, you know, you grew up where I live, sunny all the time. You know, I grew up in New York, 50% in New York by 2030 from renewables. How do you anticipate reaching that? Primarily through big centralized projects or by significantly expanding the distributed energy?
So we have to do things differently than we've been doing in the past. We can't just bolt on more and more renewables on top of a system which is already financially and energy inefficient. So 50% renewables also means a tremendous focus on energy efficiency. So we do expect, and the reason why the governor has set this out as a mandate is because we believe we can achieve these objectives on a very cost-effective basis by changing the rules of the game. So we will, so I'll give you an example of how the system can be both cleaner and cheaper, maybe two quick examples. So right now, the system is built so that all your appliances in your house can go on at the same moment. Now they don't, but some number go on at the same time. Well, there certainly can be chips in all those appliances so that your washing machine and your air conditioner can cycle off moments at a time. You would never notice the difference. But what happens is that the current system, in order to satisfy this peak demand, power plants have to be turned on, and not only is it really expensive, some of the power plants that are turned on to satisfy the peak can be diesel plants, can be the most dirty kinds of plants. So by having chips installed, you'd have a system which would be cheaper because there'd be less peak power produced, and it would also be cleaner. Or when we think about, we always hear about the intermittency of wind and you know, solar of renewables. Well, and so the way we've been deploying renewables is to have a lot of fossil fuel backup to deal with those renewables, which is also kind of tying up all this capital. So let's imagine instead a system which can exist by changing the rules and the financial incentives, which we are doing, where intermittency is paired with demand response or demand management, so that you need less of that fossil fuel backup. So that's another example of being able to integrate more renewables into a system, an integrated system, where it'll be cheaper and cleaner.
And the renewables that you're adding, though, explain, what will they be? You expect primarily wind, primarily solar, distributed? What will be the power?
It's going to be a combination, but it's going to be a significant amount of onshore wind. In the 2020s, excuse me, there will be offshore wind, and one of the benefits of offshore wind in New York is that's close to the population center, and solar.
Yeah. When all of this is done, will electricity costs be higher or lower for average families, and will the total burden on the bill be higher or lower? Because presumably, even if the costs are higher, the burden could be lower if you're using less. What do you anticipate? What will happen on the costs as you meet these goals?
A key element is affordability, and you know it's of course one of these things where, and you know this, Ron, from other kinds of government, thinking about government programs and budgets, because it's always about what it would have been. Well, we're on a trajectory of the system becoming more and more unaffordable, business as usual. And so we're quite confident that it will be certainly more affordable than it would have been under business as usual. And we believe we can use really substantially the current cost envelope of the bill to finance the system of the future.
Now, as part of the REV process, you have spent a lot of time thinking about how you ensure that the benefits of both clean energy and efficiency extend not only to upper middle class communities, but also to lower income communities. And in May, you announced a big policy on affordability. One key element, more discounts for low-income utility consumers. But the release on the policy said, quote, reducing the energy burden of low-income households and ensuring their participation in the clean energy economy cannot be accomplished through rate discounts alone and requires a more comprehensive strategy.
Yes.
What does that look like?
Okay, well, so let's just sort of dimension this. 1 million New Yorkers have difficulty paying their electric bills. 1 million people. We have $800 million of bills in arrears. And this is only getting worse. We cannot achieve the goals that we just talked about, 50% renewables by 2030, a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 over 90 levels without the participation of the low and moderate income communities. It's not going to be possible. And when I talked about the objectives that when the governor called, it's for all New Yorkers. But as in other examples, vulnerable communities are the first to experience problems that everybody else experiences. So the things that I've been talking about are really, really driven by not thinking about treating the solution to low-income customers as a bolt-on. It's just give a grant. We don't have enough grants, and that's not dealing with it. That's dealing with a symptom, not the underlying problem that we're trying to solve. So I think a comprehensive approach, or beyond what I've been talking about, because what we're talking about is quite comprehensive, but we want to give maybe one example of rethinking something. When we think about retrofitting multifamily housing, multifamily low-income housing, the current approach is from grants. We do a few thousand a year. That's really great. It's not scalable. So instead, what we're going to do is to have, borrowing a program that's been successful in Europe, is to go and do a design competition and approach the variety of owners of low-income housing, multifamily housing, and ask them what it is that they need for a retrofit. And this has, again, been a program that was successful in the Netherlands, and by creating a large market for retrofits, what happened in the Netherlands is there was a design competition that resulted in an external building envelope for housing, so the tenants didn't have to move out. It had a significant reduction in energy efficiency, improvement in health benefits, and that's the kind of program that we're going to be launching later in the year, and that will have the effect of being able to retrofit hundreds of thousands of units.
I was going to ask you, maybe that's part of the answer, which is, a lot of people thinking about these issues often talk about the split incentive problem. How do you provide benefit for renters? How do you create incentives for landlords who are often simply just passing through the cost? How do you create incentives for them to engage?
Okay, so here's another idea, and this is something we're thinking about, so I want to say that it's in the context of thinking about it. So I talked about changing utility incentives before. Maybe this is a good idea would be to, generally in New York, we're not permitting utilities to own distributed energy solutions. I don't need to go into all the reasons for that. But maybe what would make sense would be to give the utilities the opportunity to put in the rate base, which is of course their business, all investments related to improvements in a building, insulation, windows, all that. But in that, it would have controls that would enable the load in that building to be adjusted to satisfy the thing's peak demand. And so this kind of approach, particularly in so many grid-constrained areas in the state, might actually wind up not only having the ability to retrofit a lot of single-family homes, which people rent, which are going to be difficult to scale up otherwise for the split incentives. Not only do more of that, but actually might cost the system, might be very economic, because when you delivering power in grid-constrained areas is really expensive. And if you can create energy efficiency and the ability to adjust the load in these locations, it reduces costs for everybody.
I want to bring in the audience here. I want to ask you two final things before I do. What is the role of the EPA Clean Power Plan in your vision? How, does that impede, advance? How does that fit into what you're trying to do?
We were embarked on this approach before the EPA reported the Clean Power Plan. So we obviously endorse it, but
does it make it easier? Does it make it harder?
It doesn't
affect you.
It doesn't affect us. I mean, I think just maybe for everybody. What I would say in terms of the federal government versus the state government is that there's this divided regulatory authority between the federal government and states when it comes to the power sector. So the federal government regulates wholesale markets, power generation. States regulate distribution and around retail markets. And that made a lot of sense in a time when there's a line of demarcation where electrons float in one direction. It makes less and less sense when we think about this new grid where electrons flow in multiple directions. And you have mini power plants, you have solar, you're kind of a mini power plant, you're producing power, it makes less and less sense. So all the authorities that the changes we're making are being done at the state level using state authorities. So states have a tremendous amount of influence in doing all the stuff that we're trying to do. And so it would be helpful at some time to take up this idea of what's the new regulatory partnership between the states and federal.
Final question before we bring in the audience. There is obviously, as you know, a tug of war underway in many states between utilities and solar companies over net metering. And one of the milestones you've reached as part of this REV process in New York is you have found, as they would have said in the 1990s, a third way. Explain a little bit about what you're doing and whether it's a model for other states.
Well, so and of course this is the net metering battle. So really it goes to the question about location, because as I said at the beginning, what we've been doing with distributed energy solutions is we've been bolting it onto the system, and so in some cases the distributed solutions have a lot of value for that customer. They can save customers money, depending on the system. You have a fuel cell, it has better power quality, more resilience. So it can be good for those customers. The question is it good for all customers? And the answer to that question is it can be good for all customers depending on location. And so that's what we have. And so there are really two elements to why the solar industry and utilities have found common ground in New York State. One is the idea that there's going to be an increasing emphasis on deploying distributed solutions in locations and appropriate pricing so that it's valued by location. And the other thing is the opportunity for utilities to earn, not by owning solar, but by helping to promote solar, and again, since we talk about locations, I've said it now several times, in certain locations there are meaningful cost savings that utilities can earn from. And so it means that utilities and solar companies now can view each other as partners and customers of each other as opposed to the enemy.
Have you been, do you think this is a model for other states?
Well, well, if it happens in New York, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, we think that we believe that this is a pro-growth, pro-consumer model that not only in other states, but I've had the opportunity. I was with people from Brazil yesterday, because we've exported the same policy and regulatory model around the world, and everywhere in the world there's the same pressure. You talk to people in Brazil,
Yeah.
they're worried about net metering in Brazil, and they're worried about net metering in India, and so we have to come up with approaches. We believe we've come up with approaches that can work lots of places.
Let's bring in the audience. Question over here in the back.
Well, with tax equity advisors, I'm wondering about community solar. There's a lot of talk about it, and I think it means different things to different players. So sort of what does it mean in the context of what's happening in New York, and what do you envision its future?
Okay, so we do have community solar in New York, and the initial community solar projects have a certain percentage of low-income customers that need to participate in those programs.
Required?
Required. So I think that, again, the issue, that's sort of community solar, 1.0. Community solar 2.0 isn't just thinking about solar, it's thinking about a distributed energy solution that's right for that location, that may take into account storage, take into account demand management related things that are associated with those customers perhaps. And it also will take into account not it just being a regulatory mandate, but again, because we now have changed the compensation systems, again, by location, there'll be the opportunity for utilities to help earn some of the savings that will come from the deployment of that distributed solution.
Another question.
Hi, I'm Alex Breckel from the Department of Energy. You emphasize providing locational incentives for distributed solutions, generation, or efficiency. I was wondering how the REV process envisions that ensuring equity in providing locational incentives. Social demographic groups are location based, and if the cost and benefits of these distributed solutions are potentially higher in lower income neighborhoods, do you envision erecting higher barriers to distributed generation adoption, for example?
I think it's in fact maybe the other way around, right? I think that many low-income people live in areas where there are issues in the grid, and so in fact there may be very substantial value. And by the way, what we're talking about is the utilities are, some people are saying we're moving too fast, some people we're moving too slowly. So I want you to think about it as direction. Over time, there'll be, we'll get better and better at price signals, but the idea is gross price signals by location. And I hear the concern. I really think that one of the challenges that we have if we're going to achieve scale is, as a policy matter, we need to know what programs and what approaches are going to be good for what. So a lot of what I've been talking about are market-based solutions. Well, not everything is going to be solved by the market. And so it means let's think about it in a holistic way. And so so if we still, right now we're clearly on the path to major inequities. And so the approach that we're taking, we think, is going to absolutely do a much better job in terms of equity. And so the question is but we'll need to then add some things. That's when you think about adding policies to deal with where the policies are not quite working, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is a kind of patchwork and add-ons.
Let me follow up maybe as a final point with a specific example of maybe following up on that question. There was interesting about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, you had the Public Service Commission decided rather than building a new substation, $1 billion substation, to meet power needs in Brooklyn and Queens, and maybe I'm asking this as a Queens native. Yep. You decided not to build the substation and instead to have a demand management, decentralized power. Talk a little bit about, this is kind of taking the rubber meeting the road here. You're not building a new power plant, you're trying to find a new way to meet the need.
So thank you, Ron. So So this is, and to be clear, this was Con Ed, the utility that did this, thanks to, they deserve all the credit. It was thanks to the policy. So load growth in Brooklyn and Queens, business as usual, $1 billion substation. So instead, Con Ed went to the market with this problem and some also data about the system in that location, and asked market participants to come back with solutions. Unusual for utility. Utility usually says, we know what the problem is, this is what we're going to do. So it was a more open source process. And what came back from Con Ed was a range of solutions, included demand response, energy efficiency, solar, combined heat and power, and those range of alternative solutions are going to cost $200 million. So all customers benefit because there's less money spent on the system. All customers benefit because there's less peak power procured, which is really expensive in New York City, you can imagine, during the summer. And it's a cleaner solution. So we know that this can work. And so we don't need a lot of high tech to know where there are grid constraints. We don't need a lot of high tech to know when utilities have to commit capital. So you can imagine this kind of process occurring just more often.
Oh, interesting. Mr. Kauffman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.